So I'm going to start by asking a pretty simple question, and it's what can we learn from disaster response, special operations veterans, and building community? So I'm currently serving as the senior cultural chameleon for Brooklyn Boulders, and it's this kind of hybrid, funky climbing gym innovation center. We have one in Brooklyn, we have one in Boston. I'm going to tell you a couple stories about some less than conventional experiences I've had in the past decade or so that have really helped to shape the way in which I build community and culture and have applied that to startups in the States. So I'm going to take you through this at about 1,000,000 miles an hour. There's 4 pretty disparate stories. I think it'll all come clear at the end how I've started to apply this to the startup. So let's go. I spent about 6 or 7 years based in Panama, and I came to be, I specialize in kind of cultural mediation. And I took on a project towards the end in a remote area, no roads, it's only accessible by an 1.5-hour helicopter ride or 2-hour boat ride. And there's some really interesting parties operating all in this same space. This was my office, and it was one of my favorite offices. I'd go out there for about 2 weeks at a time, and I'd run these teams. This was my Panamanian team, and basically there's a Dutch group who said, hey, we know that the government is going to spend $50 million on building a road here. Yeah, but there's drug running. We kind of have a couple lawyers who have vanished in boating accidents, and there's some drugs going. What do we do out here? So they wanted to show possession of land. They wanted to start kind of claiming title. So I went in and said, how can we protect everyone's vested interests? So these are my guys. This is my construction crew. This is going to work. Haito, who's the man out front, is actually former FARC, really, really good guy. I hired him for a very specific reason. The area that we were operating in was very, very dangerous. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of drug trafficking, and a lot of indigenous populations, and Panamanians and mining companies, and everyone was kind of sketched out by one another. So Haito, I figured if the FARC show up, it could be good to have him on my side. This is the Dutch investment group. These guys come in, they kind of operate differently. They think that they know what's going on, and mind you, we are in the middle of nowhere, and they don't even necessarily speak the language. This is me flying in with a Canadian mining company who's also operating in the same region. A whole new level of evil, but they were part of the game, so we had to get to know what their vested interests were and try to get them to understand what we were up to. And these are the guys I go to work with. This was the anti-narcotics police. They just had a really, really nice boat. It happened that they had seized their boat from FARC. Great guys. They had to patrol something like 350 nautical miles of coastline with no radar, no VHF, no UHF radio. Totally simple. So it's interesting. I was working with the FARC, the anti-narcotics police, the indigenous population, a mining company. There's conflicting interests, right? So I said, how am I going to bring all of these people together? How are we going to bridge this gap? And then this happened. There was, I'm not big into disaster porn. This is kind of a PG-13 picture, but there's all of these indigenous communities that sit on riverheads, and there's a huge set of storms and flooding, and there's about 6 to 7 foot waves at the mouth of each river, which just inundate the villages, and these guys can't get out in their little pangas and their little canoes. So the only boat that was capable of getting in here was the anti-narcotics police boat, but they had no money for fuel. So the Dutch group had a lot of money. Red Cross wanted to help, but they didn't know how to get out to this area. It's like, this is interesting. So this proved to be a really, really great way to have kind of a unifying rally, call. And everybody wants to help one another, just because they're FARC, or just because they're anti-narcotics police, or because they're indigenous Panamanians, and there might be some kind of conflict in mining companies. When people are in need, everybody at the end of the day just kind of wants to get along. So we got everybody together, Dutch guys, Panamanians, local crew. We said, hey, how can we help? We basically raped and pillaged the Red Cross stores. We paid a bunch of fuel. We loaded up the police boat, and everybody worked together. And we got a ton of supplies into these villages and did that for about a week. And after that, I'll talk about this. People don't always need money. You think about currency more creatively. These guys needed food. We were, again, far away from any road or accessibility, and they were hungry. So we brought them food. At the end of this, everybody kind of got along. Everybody saw eye to eye. Everyone realized that, not everyone's here to exploit me. I can get along. And it proved to be a very, very powerful platform. What was actually in the States, from Panama, 2010, Haiti earthquake hit. I was like, I need a vacation. So I went down for search and rescue, just got on a plane, flew in. Said, hey, people need help. The initial stages of disaster response are really easy. People are in need. They need food, they need to be dug out of rubble. It's pretty linear. It's a pretty austere environment. There's lots of military, there's lots of potential security threats, and you see a lot of guys kind of walking around like this with their hats down and their guns kind of protruding. And there's a really interesting disconnect between people who are trying to help and the local population. So these are the initial days. These are the search and rescue guys I was working with. I ended up joining a joint Latin American task force, really, really great guys, digging through rubble. But then it gets, after the immediate triage stage is over, it gets a lot harder because you've got to rebuild community. You've got to, kind of help the culture get back on its feet. And what's called HADR, which is the Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Response Community, is very incestuous. There's all these norms and these cultures that persist, which aren't necessarily effective. Everyone is really well-intentioned. What ends up happening is you get hundreds of millions of dollars of aid into airports or depots, and there's just no last-mile distribution. So I finished search and rescue. I was like, why am I crawling around 3 stories underground when there's all these aftershocks and it's a week later and no one's still going to be alive? So I'm like, this game's over. How else can I help? And someone had sent me this guy's phone number and said, hey, call this dude. So I pull out my satellite phone. I call Mikey. Had no idea who he was. He was a former naval independent hospital corpsman. He was the in-country director for a small NGO called Hope for Haiti. He spoke Creole. He had a really small operations team. He picked me up in his truck, and 6 months flew by. He's what we call a force multiplier. He's someone who can add a tremendous amount of value with very little resources. We had 2 trucks. We had a couple Haitian guys who we work with, and we knew how to operate in the environment. We did not have to have 1 million security personnel. We did not have to drive around with our windows up and our doors locked. We could operate at 4 in the morning when there was no traffic and everyone else had to be in their locked security compounds. Very, very valuable type of guy. This is Dr. Steve, local Haitian guy, spoke almost, I think, 4 or 5 languages, and knew the nuances, knew who needed help. A lot of these large organizations come in with their preconceived notions, come in with their operating norms, and it's not necessarily effective. They don't know how to move and who to talk to and how to effectively get things out there. So we basically did everything we could simply to empower the Haitians and to have them lead us in distributing gear, and this was an IDP camp that we were running. So we did a lot of, again, finding the guys who had all the stuff that people needed, and we begged and pleaded, and we loaded up onto our trucks, and we got it out into the camps. And the lessons I learned, in Haiti was you can't have any preconceived notions. Everyone said, you're going to Haiti, you're crazy, it's a really dangerous place, what are you doing? And I said, no, if I can get along with the FARC and not get killed, I'm pretty sure Haiti would be okay. And they turned out to be really lovely people. But there was still this big disconnect between these aid workers and the military and everyone kind of walking around like this and not interacting with the locals. This is not going to work. So I tried to lighten things up a little bit, and I'd brought down this huge bag of toys with me. And so I armed myself. I said, I don't need a gun, I don't need pepper spray. These Haitian kids are really cool, and I need to really have a larger impact and more of a force than I have currently. So I went out and I courted an army, and I had my toy, my quacking duck, I had some chalk, and I went out and said, hey guys, I need help. And I made friends, right? And this is me, this is my little kid army. And I empowered them. I said, guys, I got hundreds of tons of food I gotta get out. I got medical supplies, I got hospitals I gotta build, I got water pipelines I gotta lay, and everyone wants to help and contribute, and they're really disenfranchised because everything's been wiped out, everybody in their family has unfortunately passed away or whatever, and they need a purpose. And so I gave them, we gave them a purpose. And it was really effective. And the greatest tool I had in Haiti was this quacking duck, which was a stuffed animal thing that went like this. And when other guys are walking around and the safety net they have is looking very ominous and very threatening, my hat was up, I had a big smile, and if we got in a really heated situation, I'd pull out the duck and it'd go quack, 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 quack. And it would completely disarm everything and everyone. It's like, who is this white guy with a quacking stuffed animal duck in the middle of a riot? Very powerful tool. Another very disparate story. I had the pleasure of working a lot with special operations personnel in various capacities, in various facets of what I did. Incredible guys. We now know in society that these guys are very valuable assets, but there's still this monstrous disconnect, and everyone thinks, they're shooters, okay, maybe they're valuable in business, but I don't know how. I don't know, how do I find them? What are they really good for? So I created this organization called Tactivate, and I had learned the power, and it really came true, and I really learned this with this organization, that sometimes you just need a physical platform. Sometimes you just have to bring people together. You can't use digital, an app won't work. And that's what I did. I had a great crew of guys, pararescue men, Army Rangers. A lot of them spoke 3 languages. Some of them could code. They've got more EQ than anyone I've ever met 10 times over. They have more integrity and operational capabilities than anyone I've ever met. And they're the epitome of the perfect entrepreneur, but they have no idea how their skills are applicable. And most people in the private sector have no idea how their skills are relevant. So I set this physical platform up. These guys run these courses where we used disaster response, situational awareness, emergency medicine simply as a medium to bring these guys are like the CEOs of the military. They're the most forward-leaning, proactive guys. They operate in small units. And I put them in front of really, really progressive, forward-leaning CEOs and entrepreneurs, and help them both sides understand how they were valuable to one another by using these training scenarios as just a medium to do that. And we take these guys, these entrepreneurs, out of their comfort zone. We teach them some hard skills, but really what's happening is they're getting to spend time with these veterans, and they realize by physically being in touch with one another how they're both complementary. So we run all these courses, my guys. How does this all tie into the U.S.? Why are all these stories relevant? Brooklyn Boulders is this kind of, like I said, this hybrid, rock climbing center. We've got a current facility in Brooklyn. We just opened one in Boston, and we're, expanding like crazy. The premise is physicality stimulates innovation and creativity and blurring the lines between work, life, and play. So we've got these phenomenally beautiful platforms, and Chris, who's actually our chief development officer, is in the crowd. We start with these really raw spaces. And I've been to some funky places, but I don't know if you guys have ever been to Boston. That's one of the most hectic and dangerous environments I've ever worked in. I don't know if you ever met Boston contractors, but good God. This is what our space looks like, and it's raw. We have to create a community. We have to create a movement. We have to create a culture. So we start with this. Chris leads our team through these kind of human-centric design. We very specifically look at how can we design a physical space to really force communal interaction, an extroverted experience. We want people who would never otherwise come in contact with one another to be exposed to one another and have conversations. And so we start with that as our physical design. And then very quickly I apply the same methodologies and techniques I learned in building indigenous capacity in Haiti or in Panama, or working with veterans to building community. So what's my duck? What was my tool in Somerville, Massachusetts? And one of the most powerful platforms proved to be dinner. And in the construction site, before we had even had anything take shape, I started hosting all of these hard hat dinners, where I'd go out and I would find the most badass yogi, or the craziest aerial artist, or a kid who was a unicycle expert, or who was the most progressive VC in all of Boston, and I put them together at a table. And this guy was a world champion beatboxer. She's a PhD from MIT. Mike Del Ponte, I'm sure half of you guys in here know, is just a brilliant marketer. We bring all these these types of people together and see what happens, and ask them, how can we create the space? What does your community need? How can we be of value to you? So we don't have a preconceived notion. We are a rock climbing gym, but how can we create ourselves to be really advantageous? And we do that by bringing in really crazy random stuff. This is Action Bronson, who's a 355-pound white rapper. This is still when we're under construction, and what we're trying to do is build our army, build our influencers. We don't do traditional advertising. We're not trying to court 1 million people. We want to have a really, really tight, vibrant community. And so we bring all these people into our space, and we expose them to wild and crazy things that they would never otherwise experience, at least together under one roof. And they become our evangelists. They become our initial community months and months before we open our doors. And as you can see, I equate that to our kid army in Haiti, right? We find the best artists, and we say, hey, here are the keys to our 40,000 square foot facility. Please try to keep the illegal activities down to a minimum, but have at it. And these guys spent 3 months in our space for free, doing the most wild and beautiful street art you've ever seen, because they had a space that they can memorialize their work, where they weren't going to get arrested. And then as our space starts to take shape, and again, Chris designed these really beautiful walls covered in Baltic birch. It's very architectural. The design is beautiful. And then as our community grows and as we open, the people that we've quartered, that would never otherwise even be interested in rock climbing, say, hey, I want to use your space. I'm a Red Bull trials bike rider, and I want to come jump over a bunch of bodies, and I want to rock climb. Or in Brooklyn, when Hurricane Sandy hit, Team Rubicon is a disaster response organization we're very close with. They said, hey, dude, I need a place to house 300 veterans to launch a disaster response initiative in Brooklyn and the surrounding areas and the Far Rockaways. Sure, we had 300 veterans crashed out in a rock climbing gym for over a month. We have aerial artists swinging from the ceiling, randomly. It's how can we how can we, bring really crazy mediums to bear? How can we jar people out of, their typical experiences? Chris Tompkins, co-founder of Patagonia, so we have a lot of intellectual stimulation going on. This is my favorite picture. This about sums up Brooklyn Boulders. That's a kid in a sumo suit riding a unicycle. That is who we are. TEDx comes, and it's just, this is what's going on during a TEDx. I mean, where else have you? TEDx's are kind of a dime a dozen these days, but we had parkour workshops going on, and people swinging from the ceiling, and live music, and all during these really, really provocative speeches. And this is the space, gives you an idea. How can we, how are we trying to share what we believe in? I created this thing called the active collaborative workspace, and I had mentioned that physicality stimulates innovation and creativity is one of our biggest beliefs. So we host these startup teams, people come into our space, and we really tried to shatter this notion of work, life, and play. I have to go to work, and then I have to go home and cook dinner, and and then I have to go exercise. We wanted to bring it all together: cultural stimulation, art, music, work, pursuing what you love. So we designed the active collaborative workspace. This is on top of a huge bouldering wall. The desks are stand-up desks. There's built-in pull-up bars. Our rent is 5 pull-ups per half an hour, or 5 sit-ups per half an hour, or a conversation with someone at the table. And you get these startups sitting in here, and they'll all work together, and they'll go for a climbing session. They'll take a capoeira class. They'll sit in the sauna, and you see them being really invigorated in a way that you wouldn't otherwise see in a traditional collaborative workspace or startup environment. And that's how we hope to share, or kind of inject a little bit of our DNA into their cultures and to have that perpetuated. This is our team. Part of our team, Chris is actually in the audience, he's not in here. Very diverse group. You can't do anything without your team. And here's a space to see what we brought to light. Some tools that I've used, some takeaways for you guys. If there's a bunch of marketers in the room, the marketing funnel is typically turned the other way around, and you throw all these huge inputs in, and you want this little output. We think about it differently. We flip that upside down and kind of taking a special operations approach. Like, what is the minimal amount of input we can put into this thing to have the maximum output? So, we decide what our concept is. We feed it into this funnel. We go and we identify who are our biggest force multipliers, who can evangelize for us. And we try to have this massive amplified effect. And this, I spent a lot of time at survival school growing up. Concentric rings, you learn how to listen in the woods, and bird language, you can understand, if a bird alarms, who's moving in the woods, what happens when what's amplified. So we think about when we drop a campaign, when we launch a new facility, what is the amplification effect we're going to have? If we have this nugget, our physical location, how is that going to perpetuate when it's relayed through the physical community, or the music community, the arts community? And then I'm going to show you guys a little video of what's kind of transpired, and and that'll be that.
This is not your typical workspace at all. It's not meant to be polished or quiet. The entire premise of this project is physicality stimulates innovation and creativity, and blurring the lines between work, life, and play. Welcome to the Active Collaborative Workspace in Brooklyn Boulders, Somerville. Right here we're actually sitting on top of a huge 122-foot long, 22-foot high climbing wall. So it's nothing like your traditional collaborative workspace. So you're not going to see people just really tuned into their computers. What you're going to see is push-ups and sit-ups and loud cheering and constant movement. The desks behind me are stand-up desks with built-in pull-up bars. These are balance ball desks. So the entire area is just covered in street art. And welded sculptures and photos from local photographers. So it's great when we have a lot of our partners working out of this area. We've had Uber and Zipcar and Vita Coco teams up here, as well as the Puma group that planned their Olympic campaign. And it's really been great to see them take advantage of it. The Red Bull team has been in here, along with a slew of local startups. It's also great to host the Cambridge Innovation Center. So it's really not uncommon to see a young startup working in this area, and they'll all get up and they'll go for a climbing session, or they'll take a capoeira class or a yoga class, or they'll sit in the sauna. And we found that when you blur the lines between work, life, and play under one facility, it really enhances productivity and creativity, and people have an absolute blast.
Guys, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks to the PSFK team.